They said the king had gone mad. They said he was tearing the kingdom apart, looking for a ghost. Selene touched the gentle swell of her belly and knew the truth. The king wasn't mad. He was broken. And she was the missing piece. 6 months. 6 months since the world had shattered. 6 months since she had fled into the biting cold of the northern woods, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a secret growing within her. The mark on her hip, a delicate swirl that mirrored the one over King Alaric's heart, was a constant burning reminder. It was supposed to be a symbol of destiny, of a love blessed by the moon goddess herself. Now it was a source of agonizing pain, a bond sickness that ebbed and flowed with the tides of his despair. Some days it was a dull, hollow ache, a phantom limb she couldn't scratch. On others it was a searing fire, and she would collapse on the rough-hewn floor of her tiny cottage, gasping, knowing that hundreds of miles away her mate was in the throes of a feral rage. He was suffering, and it was her fault. Or, at least, that's what the world believed. The cottage was her sanctuary and her prison. Nestled deep in the whispering woods, it was a forgotten speck on the edge of the kingdom, a place where the trees grew so thick they blotted out the sun, and the silence was broken only by the cry of a hawk or the snap of a twig. The old healer, Marta, had arranged it all before Selene fled the capital. "They will not look for you here," she had whispered, pressing a heavy purse of coins into Selene's trembling hands. "They believe you a simple servant girl who ran from a broken heart. They will not suspect the truth." The truth. That she, Selene, a girl with no name and no status, was the true mate of the Alpha King, and that she carried his heirs. Twins. Marta had confirmed it with a gentle press of her wise hands to Selena's stomach just a week before she fled. Her fingers traced the roundness of her belly now, a protective, instinctual gesture. Inside, her babies were a faint, fluttering promise. They were the reason she endured the loneliness, the gnawing fear, the soul-deep agony of the severed bond. They were all she had left of him, of the Alaric she knew. The man with eyes the color of molten gold, and a laugh that could chase away the deepest winter chill. The man who had found her in the castle kitchens, a scullery maid covered in flour, and had frozen, his alpha senses recognizing her on a level so profound it stole the air from his lungs. Their courtship had been a secret, stolen thing. Meetings in hidden alcoves, hands brushing in crowded corridors, late-night whispers in the royal gardens under the moon's watchful eye. He had promised her everything. On the night of the great choosing, he'd murmured against her hair, his voice thick with devotion, "I will call your name before the entire pack. I don't care about status or bloodlines. You are my destiny. You are my queen." She had believed him. She had stood in the shadows of the great hall that night, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her simple servant's dress feeling like a costume she was about to shed. The air was thick with the scent of pine and burning incense, the hall packed with every wolf in the kingdom, from the highest lord to the lowest Omega. Then the moment came. King Alaric stood on the dais, magnificent in his ceremonial furs. But his eyes were wrong. They were glassy, unfocused. When they swept the crowd, they passed over her without a flicker of recognition. A cold dread, slick and oily, had washed over Selene. The bond mark on her hip, which had been thrumming with joyful heat, suddenly felt icy. He raised his hand, and the hall fell silent. Selene's name was on the tip of her tongue, a prayer. But the name that left his lips was not hers. "Lady Ilara Van Thorn." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Lady Ilara, smug and triumphant in her silken gown, glided to the dais. She was of high birth, politically advantageous, but everyone knew she was not his mate. The pack could feel the discordance, the lie in the air. Selene felt it as a physical blow. The world tilted, the sounds of the hall muffled as if she were underwater. She saw Alaric take Ilara's hand, his movements stiff, puppet-like. She saw Ilara's venomous, victorious smile as she looked directly at Selene in the shadows. It was a look that said, "I have won. You are nothing." The pain was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if a physical cord connecting her soul to his had been violently severed. She had stumbled from the hall, blind with tears, her hand clapped over her mouth to stifle a sob that would have torn her in two. That was when Marta had found her, her old eyes sharp with suspicion. "His wine," Marta had hissed, pulling her into an empty chamber. "I saw her brother, Lord Vara, hand him the goblet. There was something in it. His scent is wrong, muted." Wolfsbane, a compound so vile it could cloud an alpha's mind, suppress his instincts, and temporarily sever the mate bond. It induced a fugue state, a madness where the victim could be easily manipulated. There was no time. Ilara and her family would not let a rival, the true mate, live. "You must run," Marta had insisted, "for the child." Selene hadn't even known then. It was a desperate hope, a flicker of intuition. She had fled into the night, a ghost leaving behind a kingdom she was meant to rule, and a man who was her other half. Now the rumors that trickled in with the occasional traveling merchant who passed near her woods painted a grim picture. King Alaric had awoken 3 days after the ceremony, screaming her name. Not Selene, a name only he and Marta knew, but my mate. He had torn his chambers apart, his feral rage terrifying the entire court. When Ilara, his proclaimed mate, tried to soothe him, he had thrown her against a wall, his golden eyes blazing with a madness that didn't recognize her. He was hunting. He had dispatched his entire royal guard, his most loyal beaters, to every corner of the kingdom. He was looking for a woman whose name he couldn't remember, whose face was a blur in his poisoned mind. All he had was her scent, a phantom whisper of vanilla and moonlight that was driving him insane. He was the Mad King, and Lady Ilara, a spurned and humiliated false mate, was consolidating her power at court, whispering that the king's grief over his true mate's rejection had broken his mind. She was the true threat, a viper coiling around a fractured throne. A sharp crack from outside the cottage jolted Selena from her memories. She froze, her hand flying to her belly. It was probably just a deer, but the fear was a constant companion. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows through the trees. She peered through the grimy window pane. Nothing, just the endless, silent woods. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, and turned back to the meager fire crackling in the hearth. The loneliness was a physical weight, heavier some days than others. Today it was crushing. She missed him. Not the Mad King of the rumors, but her Alaric. She missed the safety of his arms, the deep rumble of his voice, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. Suddenly, a violent kick from within her womb made her gasp. It was stronger than usual, sharp and insistent. Then another. The twins were restless tonight. It often happened when the bond sickness flared, as if they could feel their father's anguish through her. She rubbed her stomach, murmuring soft words. "It's all right, little ones. We're safe. We're safe." But she didn't feel safe. A primal instinct, a hum of unease, was vibrating under her skin. Something was wrong. She heard it then. Not a crackle of wood, but the soft, deliberate crunch of a boot on snow. Then another. More than one. They were trying to be silent, but a wolf's hearing, even an unmated she-wolf's, was sharp. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Merchants didn't come this deep into the woods, and they didn't travel after dark. These were not friendly visitors. These were hunters. Ilara's hunters. They had found her. Panic seized her. She looked around the tiny one-room cottage. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The single door, the two small windows. It was a trap. Her first thought was of her babies. She had to protect them. Her maternal instinct, a force more powerful than she'd ever known, overrode the terror. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its weight a pathetic comfort in her hand. She backed away from the door, placing herself in the farthest corner, trying to make her body a shield for the precious life she carried. The silence outside stretched, taut and terrible. They were surrounding the cottage, she knew it. They were waiting. For what? For her to make a move? For full darkness to fall? The bond mark on her hip flared with a sudden sharp heat, a spike of pure agony. It wasn't the familiar ache of Alaric's despair. This was different. It was a warning. A jolt of furious protective energy flooding the bond from his end. Did he know? Could he feel her terror from across the kingdom? The cottage door didn't just open. It exploded inward, ripped from its hinges by a powerful kick. Splinters of wood flew across the room. 3 figures, clad in black leather and smelling of cold iron and malice, filled the doorway. They were masked, but she could see the glint of their cruel eyes in the firelight. In their hands they held crossbows, the bolts tipped with a familiar, sickeningly silver sheen. Wolfsbane poison. Not just to kill her, but to do it painfully, to ensure the Alpha's lineage died with her in agony. "Nowhere left to run, little servant," one of them rasped, his voice a gravelly sneer. He took a step into the cottage, raising his crossbow. Celine tightened her grip on the poker, her knuckles white. She was terrified, but a strange, cold calm was settling over her. If she was going to die, she would die fighting for her children. She would not let them take her easily. Just as the assassin's finger tightened on the trigger, a blur of motion erupted from the side of the cottage. Another man, huge and broad-shouldered, slammed into the first assassin, driving him back out into the snow. He roared, a sound of pure protective fury, and Celine's heart leaped. Gunnar. It was Gunnar, Alaric's oldest and most loyal beta. His silver-streaked hair was wild, his face grim. He must have tracked her. He must have followed the assassins. "Get behind me, my lady," he growled, drawing a massive sword. He didn't wait for an answer, turning to face the other 2 assassins who were now charging him. The small clearing outside the cottage became a whirlwind of desperate violence. The clang of steel on steel echoed through the woods. Gunnar was a legendary warrior, an old soldier who had fought in 100 battles, but he was 1 against 3, and they were younger, faster. Celine watched in horror from the doorway, her hand pressed to her stomach. Gunnar fought like a cornered wolf, his sword a silver arc of death. He took one of the assassins down, his blade finding a gap in the man's leather armor. But as he did, another fired his crossbow. The bolt hit Gunnar high in the shoulder. He roared in pain, stumbling back, the silver tip burying itself deep. The wolfsbane would work fast on him. He was already slowing, his movements becoming clumsy. The third assassin, the leader, saw his chance. He lunged, his own sword aimed at Gunnar's heart. "No!" The scream was ripped from Celine's throat. A wave of energy, hot and blinding, surged through her. She threw her hands out, not even thinking. A shimmering shield of pure, silvery moonlight erupted from her palms, slamming into the assassin just as his blade was about to strike. It wasn't a physical force, but it was enough. The man recoiled as if he'd been shocked, his eyes wide with disbelief behind his mask. He had felt it, the raw, untamed magic, the power of the Moon Mother. But the effort drained her. She staggered, dizzy, the world tilting. The momentary distraction was all Gunnar needed. With a final, desperate roar, he drove his own sword through the assassin's gut, but it was too late. The second assassin, the one Gunnar had wounded, had reloaded his crossbow. He raised it, his aim steady, pointing it directly at Selena's heart. Gunnar was too far away, too wounded to stop him. This was it. The end. Selena closed her eyes, one hand still protectively on her belly, and sent a final, silent prayer of love down the broken bond to her king. "I love you, Alaric. Protect our children." The crossbow fired. The whistle of the bolt cutting through the air was the last thing she heard. But the impact never came. Instead, there was a sound that defied description. A sound of rage so profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was a roar that was part wolf, part man, and all godlike fury. The entire wall of the cottage to her left didn't just break, it atomized. Wood, plaster, and snow exploded outward in a deafening blast. And from the dust and chaos, a monster emerged. It was a wolf, but a wolf of impossible size, larger than any she had ever seen. Its fur was the color of a starless midnight, its muscles coiling like massive ropes beneath its hide. And its eyes were not the eyes of an animal. They were the color of molten gold, burning with a terrifying feral intelligence. And they were fixed on her. Alaric. He had found her. The Mad King had come. He moved with a speed that was a blur to the human eye. The assassin who had fired the bolt had a moment, just a single fleeting moment, to register the colossal black wolf that was suddenly upon him. Alaric didn't just kill him. He unmade him. A blur of black fur, a flash of claws like sickles, and the man was simply gone, a red smear against the pristine snow. The other wounded assassin, the first one Gunnar had fought, scrambled backward, his face a mask of pure terror. He dropped his weapon, trying to turn and flee. Alaric was on him in a single bound. The Alpha King's jaws, filled with teeth like daggers, closed around the man's neck. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and then silence. A profound, ringing silence in the aftermath of the storm. The massive black wolf stood over the carnage, its broad chest heaving. Blood dripped from its muzzle onto the snow. The feral, golden eyes, which had held nothing but incandescent rage, slowly softened as they focused on Selene. The madness was still there, a wildfire burning just behind his gaze, but beneath it there was something else. Recognition, agony, love. He took a hesitant step toward her, a low whine escaping his throat. It was the most heartbroken sound she had ever heard. Selene was trembling, not with fear, but with a tidal wave of emotions too powerful to name. Relief, grief, love, terror. It was all there. He was here. He was real. He was a monster, a feral thing of beautiful, terrible power. But he was her monster. "Alaric," she whispered, her voice cracking. The sound of his name seemed to break a spell. The giant wolf shuddered, a tremor running through its massive frame. It squeezed its eyes shut, and with a grotesque sound of cracking bones and tearing flesh, it began to change. The transformation was violent, agonizing. He collapsed to the ground as his form shrank, fur receding, bones reshaping. When it was over, he lay naked in the snow, curled in on himself, weeping. Not the proud king, not the feral alpha. but a broken man. He pushed himself to his knees, his body covered in the dust of travel and the blood of his enemies. He crawled the last few feet toward her, not daring to stand. His golden eyes, now human and swimming with tears, were fixed on her face, as if she were a mirage he was afraid would vanish. "Selene," he choked out, his voice raw from screaming her name for months. He finally remembered seeing her, smelling her. The proximity had broken through the last of the poison's hold. "You are alive. They told me you were gone, that you had run, that you didn't want me. I would never leave you," she sobbed, tears finally streaming down her face. She took a step toward him, her hand outstretched. He flinched back, as if afraid to touch her, afraid he would contaminate her with his madness. I went mad," he whispered, his gaze dropping in shame. "I couldn't find you. The scent. It was everywhere and nowhere. A fire in my head. I tore the world apart for you." It was then that his gaze fell from her face to her body, to the unmistakable swell of her stomach, hidden beneath her simple wool dress. His eyes widened. The air crackled with a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The world seemed to stop. The burning mark on his chest, the mirror to her own, must have been screaming the truth at him. He looked from her belly to her eyes, a question dawning in their golden depths that was too profound for words. He fell to his knees in the blood-stained snow. His trembling hand, still covered in grime and gore, hovered over her stomach. He was shaking, a massive alpha king brought to his knees by a truth he was only just beginning to comprehend. "May I?" he whispered, his voice thick with a desperate, holy reverence. Selene nodded, her own tears blurring her vision. She took his hand and guided it to rest on the curve of her belly. The moment his skin touched the fabric of her dress, a powerful, violent kick erupted from within her womb, pressing against his palm. Then another from the other side. The twins, acknowledging their father, responding to his touch. A sound, a guttural sob of pure, unadulterated shock and joy and grief, was torn from Alaric's chest. The Alpha King, the mad king who had terrorized a kingdom, wept. He pressed his forehead against her stomach, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his emotion. "Mine," he rasped, the word both a question and a declaration. "They are mine." "Yes," Selene whispered, her fingers tangling in his filthy, matted hair. "They are yours, Alaric. They have always been yours." The bond between them, stretched and frayed and tormented for so long, didn't just snap back into place. It ignited. A torrent of warmth, love, and belonging flooded her, chasing away the cold ache of the bond sickness for the first time in 6 months. She felt him, his soul locking with hers, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that he was home. He was back, and he would never let her go again. He stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the snow, his head pressed to her belly, his hands protectively cradling the life within. He was drinking in their presence, anchoring himself to the reality of them. The feral madness in his eyes was receding, replaced by a clarity and a cold, simmering fury, directed not at the world, but at the ones who had done this to them. From a broken heart to a throne. Selene's story proves that you can't fight fate. If you enjoyed this story, please hit like and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to believe in happy endings. Finally, he looked up, his golden eyes meeting hers. The shame was still there, but it was overshadowed by a resolve as hard as steel. "I did not choose her," Alaric roared, the sound echoing in the silent, winter-choked woods. The king was back, and his voice held all the power of his station. "I was drugged, poisoned. I woke up 3 days later in my bed, with her scent all over my rooms and a hole in my memory. I was screaming your name, but I couldn't see your face. They told me you had fled the city after I rejected you. Elara, she told me you were a nobody, a servant girl I had toyed with, and that my wolf was simply grieving a dalliance. She said my true mate bond with her would settle in time. He spat her name like a curse. I knew it was a lie, he continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. My soul was screaming for you. I could smell you on the wind, in my dreams, a ghost I was chasing. I never stopped looking. He looked over at the still form of Gunnar, who was groaning, clutching the wolfsbane-tipped bolt in his shoulder. Alaric's eyes narrowed. He strode over, and, with a surgeon's care that belied his earlier savagery, he snapped the shaft of the bolt and, with a swift, brutal pull, ripped the poisoned head from Gunnar's flesh. The old better roared in pain, but then his breathing evened slightly. He will live, Alaric said, his voice grim. But the poison is in his blood. We need a healer. He looked at Selene. We need Marta. His gaze swept over the carnage, the destroyed cottage, the blood on the snow. This was Elara's work. She knew. She must have known you carried my heir. His fists clenched. She tried to murder my children. She tried to murder my queen. The way he said it, my queen, sent a shiver down Selene's spine. It was not a term of endearment. It was a statement of fact. What do we do? Selene asked, her voice small. The reality of their situation was crashing down. They were in the middle of nowhere, with a wounded better, and the most powerful family in the kingdom wanted her and her unborn babies dead. Alaric came to her, gently taking her face in his hands. His touch was reverent. We do what I should have done 6 months ago, he said, his golden eyes blazing with purpose. We go back. We take back my throne. We expose the traitors, and I put my true mate on the dais beside me where she belongs. No more hiding in the shadows, Selene. You are the moon-blessed queen of this pack. It is time they knew it. The journey back to the capital was nothing like her flight from it. Then she had been a terrified girl, alone and heartbroken. Now she rode on a fine mare procured from a loyalist village, wrapped in warm furs, with the Alpha King himself walking beside her, his hand never far from her or the horse's bridle. Alaric had refused to ride. He walked as a guardian, his senses on high alert, his presence a terrifying warning to any who might still be hunting them. Gunnar, his shoulder bandaged and his system slowly fighting off the wolfsbane, rode on the other side, his grim face a mask of loyal determination. They travelled quickly, stopping only at farmsteads and villages loyal to the crown. The news of the king's return to sanity and the discovery of his true, pregnant mate spread ahead of them like wildfire. Packs of loyal wolves, guards and soldiers who had grown disillusioned with Elara's influence and the king's madness began to flock to their side. What had started as a party of 3 soon became a procession of 50, then 100, then an army. They were a river of loyalty and righteous fury, flowing back towards the heart of the kingdom. During the long nights, camped under the stars, Alaric and Selene began to heal the wound between them. He would sit beside her, one large hand resting protectively on her belly, and they would talk. He told her of the hell he had endured, the fragmented memories, the phantom pains of the bond sickness, the whispers of the courtiers who called him mad, the suffocating presence of Elara, who tried to pretend they were a loving couple while he recoiled from her very scent. She, in turn, told him of her lonely vigil, the fear, the morning sickness, the joy of the first flutter of life inside her, the constant burning ache for him. She confessed her terror that he would never find her, that her children would be born fatherless, their birthright stolen. He listened to every word, his jaw tight, his golden eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. One evening, as they sat by a roaring fire, surrounded by the sleeping forms of his growing army, he gently touched the mark on her hip through her dress. "It burned," he whispered, his own hand going to his chest. "Every day, like a hot coal under my skin. I thought it was a curse, a punishment. Now I know. It was just you, calling to me." As they drew closer to the capital, their scouts brought grim news. Lady Elara, hearing of Alaric's approach and the woman with him, had seized control. She had declared the king still unwell, his mind twisted by a forest witch who had ensnared him with dark magic. She had barricaded the castle, her family's guards, the house of Van Thorn, holding the walls. And she had taken a hostage, Martyr. The old healer was to be publicly executed at dusk for treason and witchcraft, for aiding the impostor who claimed to carry the king's heir. A cold, lethal rage settled over Alaric. "She will not harm one more person loyal to you," he vowed, his voice a low growl. "We march, now." They arrived at the capital gates as the sun began its slow, bloody descent towards the horizon. The city was in chaos, torn between loyalty to their returned king and fear of the Van Thorn soldiers who patrolled the streets. Alaric's army, now thousands strong, did not need to lay siege. The city gates were thrown open from the inside by the city pack, who had never believed Elara was their true Luna. They swarmed the streets, a tide of fur and steel, overwhelming the Van Thorn guards. Alaric, Selene, and Gunnar, at the head of the royal guard, stormed the castle. They met little resistance until they reached the great hall, the same hall where Selene's heart had been shattered. Now it was the stage for their final confrontation. The massive chamber was deathly silent. Lady Elara stood on the dais, a vision in blood-red silk. Her beauty was a sharp, brittle thing, her face pale with fury and a hint of desperation. Her brother, the venomous Lord Varin, stood beside her, and between them, held with a wickedly sharp silver knife to her throat, was Martyr. The old healer was bruised and frail, but her eyes were defiant. "So," Elara called out, her voice dripping with scorn, her gaze fixed on Selene. "The little servant returns, and she's brought the mad king with her, still on his leash." She laughed, a high, ugly sound. "Did you really think you could win? I am the proclaimed mate. The pack heard the king's own words." "Words spoken through poison and lies," Alaric roared, taking a step forward. His royal guard fanned out, their swords drawn, their expressions grim. The rest of the pack, the common wolves of the capital, crowded into the hall behind them, witnesses to the final judgment.
"Lies," Elara scoffed.
Or a convenient excuse for a king who grew tired of his kitchen wench? "Look at you." Her eyes raked over Selene's simple, travel-stained dress and her swollen belly. "Pathetic. Hiding in the dirt, swelling up with your bastard children. Did you truly think he ever loved you? A nobody." Every word was a poisoned dart, meant to wound, to undermine. But Selene was not the same girl who had fled this hall 6 months ago. She met Elara's gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. She felt Alaric's rage beside her, her furnace of heat, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. This was her fight, too. "The children are no bastards," Selene said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority that surprised even her. "They are the true-born heirs of this kingdom, and I am Alaric's mate, the one the goddess chose." Elara's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "The goddess chose me, My bloodline, my power, she shrieked, losing her composure.
She pressed the knife harder against Marta's throat, drawing a thin line of blood.
This old hag will die for her part in your deception, and then you will watch as I cut your whelps from your belly myself. It was the critical mistake, the threat against her children. Something inside Selene, a power that had lain dormant for her entire life, a power she had only brushed against in the woods, finally broke free. It was not a conscious decision. It was an explosion of pure, primal, maternal instinct. Pain exploded. Not the pain of an attack, but the pain of transformation. Golden light, brighter than the sun, flooded the room, emanating from Selene herself. A collective gasp of awe and terror filled the hall. The pack wolves shielded their eyes. Alaric stared, his own golden eyes wide with shock and reverence. He knew the legends. He knew what he was seeing. Where Selene had stood, a wolf now towered. But it was no ordinary wolf.
It was enormous,
As large as Alaric's own feral form, but slender, ethereal. Its fur was the color of fresh fallen snow, shimmering with an inner light, as if spun from the moon itself. Its eyes were not gold, but a startling, fiery amber. A white wolf. A wolf of legend, a direct descendant of the moon goddess. A wolf not seen in 1,000 years. She caught the silver knife with a clawed hand. Ilara hadn't even seen her move. The legendary speed was a reality. The white wolf, Selene, held Ilara's wrist in a grip of iron, her amber eyes burning with a cold, ancient power. With a flick of her wrist, she snapped the bone. The knife clattered to the floor. Ilara screamed, a sound of agony and disbelief. Selene tossed the whimpering, broken woman aside like a doll. Lord Vara, seeing his sister defeated, drew his sword with a snarl and charged. The white wolf didn't even flinch. She simply raised a paw, and a shockwave of pure silver energy, the moonlight shield, slammed into him, throwing him back against the stone wall, where he collapsed, unconscious. The great hall was utterly silent, save for Ilara's sobbing. The entire pack, from the highest alpha to the lowest omega, stared in stunned silence. They were not just looking at the king's true mate. They were looking at a living legend, a queen of impossible power. Selene turned her amber gaze on the terrified Ilara. She did not speak, but a voice, her voice, echoed in the minds of every wolf in the hall. You poisoned your king. You tried to murder his heirs. You threatened his pack. Confess. The command was absolute, backed by an authority that was nothing short of divine.
tears and snot running down her face, her arm held at a broken angle. Ilara Van Thorn broke.
Yes, she shrieked, her confession echoing in the vast, silent hall for all to hear. I did it. I poisoned him. He was meant to choose me. I am a Van Thorn. I deserved the crown. The servant girl was nothing, a dirty secret. I sent the assassins. I wanted her and her brats dead. The confession hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. The pack turned as one, their eyes filled with disgust and fury, and looked at the woman who had dared to call herself their queen. Her fate was sealed. Alaric stepped forward, his face a mask of cold justice. He looked not at the weeping Ilara, but at the magnificent white wolf who was his mate, his queen, his Selene. Awe and an infinite, boundless love shone in his eyes. The kingdom was not just saved, it was reborn. In the aftermath, justice was swift. The entire House of Van Thorn was stripped of its titles and lands, its influence erased from the kingdom's history. Lord Varin was imprisoned for life for his part in the poisoning. As for Ilara, Alaric pronounced her sentence before the entire pack. She was not to be executed. That was too merciful. She was stripped of her name, her rank, and her pack status, and exiled to the barren lands in the far north, to live out her days as a lone wolf, shunned and forgotten. It was the ultimate humiliation, a fate worse than death for a creature as social as a wolf. With the traitors dealt with, the great hall was filled with a different energy, one of reverence. The pack elders approached Selene, who had shifted back to her human form, though a faint, silvery luminescence still clung to her skin. They knelt before her, not just as their king's mate, but as the living embodiment of their most sacred legends. She was the Moon Mother, and her coming heralded a new age of peace and prosperity. Her first act as queen was to heal the loyal. She went to Gunnar, whose face was still pale and drawn from the lingering effects of the wolfsbane. Placing her glowing palms on his wound, she poured her energy into him. The healing light, warm and golden, knitted his flesh back together and purged the last of the poison from his veins. The old beater wept with gratitude, swearing his life and sword to her for the second time. Then she went to Marta, healing the cut on her throat and the bruises from her capture. The old healer simply smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I always knew you had the power in you, my child," she whispered. "You just needed a reason to let it out." That night, the castle was quiet. The kingdom was secure. In the royal chambers, the ones Selene had only ever dreamed of, a fire crackled in the hearth. The heavy tapestries depicted ancient Alpha kings and their queens, a lineage that now included her. Alaric came to her as she stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit city. He wrapped his strong arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder and placing his hands over hers on her belly. "They are quiet," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her back. "Our little princes." "Princesses," she corrected gently. "I think one is a girl." He chuckled, a warm, happy sound she hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. "A prince and a princess, then. A perfect balance. Like us." He turned her in his arms, his golden eyes serious. The bond between them was a steady, powerful hum, a song of perfect completion. But one final act remained, the formal claiming. "Claim me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He bared his throat, an act of ultimate submission from an alpha king to his queen. "Make it complete." Selene looked into his eyes, seeing her past, her present, and all of their tomorrows reflected there. This was her king, her mate, the father of her children, the other half of her soul. With a love so fierce it was a physical ache in her chest, she leaned forward. She sank her teeth into the junction of his neck and shoulder, marking him as hers, forever. He groaned, a sound of pure pleasure and relief as the bond magic flared between them, searing and absolute. Two halves of a soul became one. When she pulled back, she gently touched the fresh mark, her mark, on his skin. He covered her hand with his eyes shining. "My queen," he breathed. "My king," she answered. 3 months later, the royal birthing chamber was filled with anxious energy. Alaric paced the floor like a caged lion, his power rolling off him in waves of nervous anticipation. Marta and a team of healers surrounded the massive bed where Selene lay, her face beaded with sweat, her body straining. She reached a hand out, and Alaric was there in an instant, his large hand enveloping hers. He pressed her knuckles to his lips. "I am here, my love. I am with you," he murmured. With one final, powerful push, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room, strong and healthy. "A boy," Marta announced, her voice filled with joy. She cleaned the infant and wrapped him in a soft blanket. He was perfect, with a shock of black hair like his father's. When Marta placed him in Selena's arms, his eyes opened. They were molten gold. Selena was crying with joy, but her body tensed again. The second baby was coming. The birth was quicker this time, and soon a second, slightly smaller cry joined the first. "And a girl," Marta said, her smile wide. She bundled the second infant and handed her to Alaric. The king, who had faced down armies and assassins without flinching, looked utterly terrified and completely smitten. His daughter was smaller, with a dusting of hair so light it was almost white. When she opened her eyes, they were not gold, but a familiar, startling, fiery amber. Later, the family was alone. The fire crackled, the kingdom was asleep. Selene lay propped against a mountain of pillows, her son Torin asleep in the crook of one arm. Alaric sat on the edge of the bed, his huge frame seeming to dwarf everything, cradling his tiny daughter Lyra against his chest, with a gentleness that defied his size. The two halves of their souls, now made whole, had created two more. A perfect family. A complete pack. Alaric looked from his daughter's amber eyes to his son's golden ones, and then to his wife, his queen, his everything. The silvery light of her power seemed to make her glow in the firelight. The memory of the pain, the madness, the separation, already felt like a distant nightmare. This was reality. This was the destiny that had been stolen from them, and that they had fought the world to reclaim. He leaned over and pressed a soft kiss to Selene's forehead, then to each of his children. "I love you," he whispered, a vow spoken into the quiet of the room. "I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Selene smiled, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. "There is nothing to make up for," she said softly. "We're home." And that is how the rejected servant became the Alpha Queen. If you believe that true love is worth burning a kingdom down for, smash that like button. Subscribe for more epic shifter romances. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you found out you were a secret queen?